Krum. I'm the CEO of a company called Mobile Moxie based in Denver, Colorado. We do mobile SEO and mobile app consulting. And I am super excited to be talking to you today about app indexing. That's going to be web app and native app indexing. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Google's new app platform called Firebase. It's all super exciting. And I know from the previous speakers that you guys have already heard some stuff about mobile, but I also know that a lot of people think mobile's a bit scary. It's new and different and tiny, and lots of people are having problems because of mobile. And so I'm empathetic, but I can feel you in your seats. And I think you might be thinking, like, come on, Cindy, I'm just a caveman. I'm just an SEO or a marketer or a copywriter. I don't know how the developers make the websites with the pictures and the videos that light up those little devices, or the apps that make the pew-pew noises. It's magic. Magic. But ladies and gentlemen, I also am just a caveman. I'm just an SEO. I'm not a developer. Sometimes the things developers say frighten and terrify me and confuse me. But what I do know is the stuff that's happening in apps is important. And I have spoken to the Google gods above, and they told me that understanding this is critical to understanding the future of the internet as a whole. And they told me a story that I'm here to convey to you. In the beginning, there was nothing. There was darkness. Google didn't even try to crawl apps or complex websites with JavaScript. They were locked out. Historically, Google hasn't even gone into those things because they were worried that they might execute malicious code. So they didn't even try. But then over time, they realized that really important, engaging stuff was happening in JavaScript websites and native apps. And so they started to crawl it. They decided that it must be indexed. So they started with JavaScript, and they crawled JavaScript, and they got better. Because if it's not crawled and not indexed, it can never rank. And they wanted to provide users a good experience. So they got better and better at crawling JavaScript, and then they started crawling Android apps, because Android was their platform, so they knew they could teach their crawlers to understand the code. Then after a while, they started crawling Apple apps, iOS apps, and indexing them. And what they found out was that crawling JavaScript websites and crawling native apps is actually quite similar. It's done primarily with lists and mapping documents and APIs. And in fact, it's less about crawling and more about ingesting this mapping information and associating it with existing web content that they already know how to evaluate, that they're already good at ranking. And so they index this stuff, but the crawling is still a bit primitive. It's still mostly based on association with a website. But at least it's there. It's especially hard for iOS apps because they don't control that code base, and Apple is super secretive. But it's indexed. And you can index not only the app itself, but the content within the app. And that's super, super exciting as an SEO. So we've reached this state of semi-enlightenment, where the content is getting indexed, but it's not super sophisticated. It's mostly based on lists and associations with web content. But that's OK. So what I want to explain to you today is I want to start by telling you about the two different kinds of app indexing that there is. There are two basic kinds of apps. There are web apps, and there are native apps. Web apps live on the internet. They're not necessarily something that you would download from an app store. And there are a lot of different names for web apps. The ones that I like are called progressive web apps, And I'm going to talk more about those in a minute. But there are a lot of terms that developers throw around that kind of mean something similar. They'll say progressive web apps, or just web apps, or HTML5 apps, JavaScript apps, dynamic websites, stuff like that. And all of those essentially mean something similar. They mean that it's a website that relies heavily on JavaScript, and specifically AJAX. And what the AJAX does is it creates an ongoing communication between the web page and the server. AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It means that when the first page loads, it might only load the first bit of content that it needs to have a good experience, and then it'll load more things based on what the user requests by clicking around on the website. So that's been around for a while, and now developers have built out all these different code bases to make web apps and dynamic websites feel more interactive, feel more like a native app, because as it turns out, people really love native app experiences. They're more fluid, and they just feel better. So this code, it gives you things like plus boxes and continuous scrolling, so you don't always have to load a new page. And that's a great experience. It's more appealing to the audience, and they don't have to wait for things as much. The problem is, with all this new code, the pages got bloated and inefficient because the code does lots of really cool stuff, but it trades off. It creates a good user experience for part of it design-wise, but then slows everything down because it has to load all this extra code, and it's inefficient. But some of it does really important things. So we use JavaScript to do things like make websites responsive. When you have a responsive website, it uses JavaScript and media queries to pull the different rendering instructions so that the page knows how to display on all the different devices. So that's really important. But what we know is that over time, pages, the file size, is getting larger and larger, even though the devices that we're trying to display it on are smaller and smaller, and often on less than reliable connections, perhaps like what we're trying to deal with sometimes in here, or in a subway. You have spotty connections trying to download massive pages, and that's a problem. So Google decided that they wanted things to be mobile friendly, and they started by saying, hey, we need you to be mobile friendly, so we need you to make your JavaScript and your CSS crawlable, and then you can have the mobile friendly tag. But recently they rolled that back because why? 80% of us did exactly what they asked us to because they created this incentive. They said, if you're mobile friendly, you have a much better chance of ranking on a mobile search result than if you're not. So now only 20% of the sites out there are not mobile friendly. So I'm wondering, is there going to be now a negative incentive? They tested this slow tag here. They clearly care about the speed, and they want the speed to be fast. So it's an interesting thing to see how are they going to incentivize us to get there. But what you can't deny is that Google wants to crawl that JavaScript. That was part of the incentive. But if you're an SEO, you might have missed this. Google actually now explicitly allows JavaScript redirects. As long as you have a rel alternate tag, it's OK to have a JavaScript redirect to handle mobile traffic to get them to the right version of the page. They say this is fine, rel alternate. They don't even mention the rel canonical, which is rare. It's interesting. So what I want to talk to you about is Google's favorite kind of web app, and it's called a progressive web app. And these are extraordinarily cool and extraordinarily fast. The reason is they put a middle layer between the server and the website. It's called a service worker, and what it does is it prefetches and pre-renders and caches all of the stuff that heavy JavaScript controls to make it feel like what's happening on your website is instant, to make it feel like a native app, like something that you've downloaded. But it's just all because of this service worker that's handling and pre-caching and pre-fetching everything. It's super cool. And if you've read anything about AMP, you might remember hearing about the AMP JavaScript runtime, which is also a middle layer that does nearly exactly the same thing, okay? So if you've seen how fast AMP pages are, then you know the value of this service worker, okay? Very similar. I think that AMP is basically like a progressive web app without an app shell, but actually just recently they launched this new thing where they have the AMP viewer, which is kind of like a full-on progressive web app. To do this, though, to have a service worker, you have to be on HTTPS. It's a requirement for AMP, and it's a requirement for a progressive web app. Fascinating other similarity. Now, if you're a progressive web app, the next thing that you have to have is called a web app manifest. And just like a plane manifest that tells you who's on the plane and the vital details of the plane, this file tells you the vital details of the web app. It tells you things, it looks like this, and it tells you things like the app title, a short and a long title, the icon, where do they find it, what does it look like, the app shell, what color should it be, the outside of the app when it's in its own window, and where should this app start on the website, so they link to the first view of the app, the default view. So that's a web app manifest. And all you do is you write that manifest and you link it from your website, and you create your service worker, and then you have a progressive web app, or PWA. And this is very, very cool stuff, because in the manifest you can do fun things like have the app load with a browser address bar, without a browser address bar. You can have it load standalone without that browser address bar, or you can have it load full screen like a game. So just like any game that you're used to playing, like Angry Birds or something like that, where you don't have the controls on the side, you can have your website load like that. That's cool. Who knew you could do that? Anyone? Right. It's awesome. The other thing you can do when you have a PWA is you can send push notifications. So most websites can't send push notifications. Only apps can, because everyone worries that they might send something malicious. But since PWAs have to be on HTTPS, they know you're not going to send anything malicious because you can't. And so PWAs allow you to send push notifications to anyone that's downloaded the PWA, just like any native app would. So what does that mean, download the PWA? Well, it's a bit confusing, but since it's a website, you can get to it from a browser, like any other website. But once you've visited the same website a couple times, it can remember and show you this little banner that says, hey, you've been here a couple times, maybe you want to download our app. And then it can download the PWA instead of downloading a native app. It'll download the PWA. All that means is it's downloading the app manifest and the service worker. So it's really fast download. It's nearly instant. And then you get an app icon, just like any other app icon from a store that you might have downloaded. You say, yes, I want this on my home screen, and you get an app, right? Nearly instantly. It's beautiful. When that happens, instead of accessing the PWA from a browser, you can access it on its own, in its own little app shell, in its own window. You can toggle between the browser and your PWA app, because it's got the color, it's got the logo, it's got the splash screen, and it's got the service worker managing everything that's happening. Anyone know you could do that? This guy. Okay. Now, the other cool thing that might blow your mind is, this works offline. Anything that the service worker has in its cache is local to the phone, so you can visit it and interact with the JavaScript offline when you don't have a web connection. So you can have a messaging app that'll wait until it gets a connection, and then it'll pass your messages and pull down messages. Or you can have a news app that's cached all the stories that you've looked at and all the sections that you've looked at before. And you can interact with it even when you have no web connection at all. So I'm going to show you a video, and I think you're going to be impressed. Maybe. Oh no, you guys. They're going to get the video going in the back. Yeah. Aren't you?
All right, so we open up a browser, and we navigate to wapo.com/PWA. So when sections load, they start caching stories for offline reading. And when you tap on the sections that you're interested in, those sections will also become available offline. As a result of this caching, tapping on an article feels instant because it's coming from the cache and not from the network. You can also swipe back and forth to move between articles in the same section, and that feels instant too. But what happens if we go offline? So we go into airplane mode, and now you can see that sections which I haven't visited yet are marked as such, but the sections that are in the cache can still be viewed. So lastly, if we keep using this app, Chrome will eventually prompt us to keep it to my home screen. So let's go back to it. Ah, there we are. Now you can add it to the home screen, and we've got an icon. And launching it from the home screen brings me to an immersive version of the Washington Post reading experience, but we didn't actually have to ship a different app or upload it to the App Store.
That's rad, right? Yeah! Come on! That's awesome! Cheryl likes it? It's awesome. And remember, that's all a website, and all you had to do was add the service worker and the app manifest. It's pretty awesome. So this is Alex Russell, and he's a Google guy, and he talks a lot about progressive web apps. And what he says is these apps aren't packaged and deployed through stores. They're just websites that took all the right vitamins. They progressively become apps. So I think this is super duper cool because it gives you the app experience without having to download it. You still get super fast stuff, or you have the option to download it. So that's really cool. What's even better about it is it solves a lot of the problems that you've been hearing about that people complain about websites, because users love these. People spend 3x more 3x more time on a progressive web app than a regular site. They have a 40% higher engagement rate, 70% higher conversion rate for people when they download it compared to the regular mobile version of the site. And they take 3x less data than the mobile version of the website. They're lighter because the service worker does all the stuff for you and caches it for you. So it's faster and lighter. It's great. Here's the problem. Web apps in general, and any dynamic content on the web, is a bit hard to index. The reason is developers who build these things are just using the JavaScript to get stuff in a continuous way from the server, so they don't actually have to have URLs to load fresh content. They get it from the server, and they don't have a URL. That creates problems for Google, because Google understands the world based on URLs. So you have to do a little bit of extra work. You have to have HTML screenshots. You have to have a really great XML sitemap. You have to use HTML5 push state, so whenever someone requests something new from the server, it updates the address bar without refreshing the page. And you have to check everything in Fetch and Render as Google to make sure that they're getting it and understanding it, right? So it's extra work. And unfortunately, not all of the PWAs out there have done this work. For instance, Washington Post. It's It's an awesome demo, but not an awesome demo from an SEO perspective because they only have this one-page index. And I'll sneak preview you guys. I am sorry, they took this down the day I was flying to Seattle. And you can, if you've been watching me on Twitter, you'll see we've been trying to bribe them to put it back up. But I am sending out right now other links to PWAs that you can try on your phone. They're not quite as screaming fast as this one because this one, the Washington Post one, they used PWA technology and they coded it in AMP HTML and AMP JavaScript, which FYI, you guys can do too. AMP HTML and JavaScript are totally free to use whenever you want, even if you're not news or not anything AMPy. You can use it and it'll be much faster. But there are other examples going out on Twitter that you can check out that are super cool. And you can do all different kinds of things in a PWA. You can do games, run trackers, anything. Most things you can do in an app, you can do in a PWA. The limitations are some of the mobile browsers have varying adoptions, but they've all got it slated for the next round of mobile browser releases. But in general, Chrome, Android, Safari all accept service workers and can handle that stuff. Here's another example, and this is a PWA that was created by a Google team as a demo. This one also not great for indexing, a little bit better. They have more than one page indexed, but sadly, they have lots of duplicate title tags, lots of duplicate meta descriptions, and really under-optimized URLs. Now, these things are not necessarily part of being a PWA. They're just part of being a developer who doesn't know SEO and doesn't have an SEO initiative driving him to optimize it. But it's all possible to optimize. So just remember, if you're going to do any dynamic content, but especially a PWA, make sure that you don't let the fancy development kill the SEO effort. Now, here's just a quick list of resources, including an app manifest wizard that will allow you to write your app manifest in less than 5 minutes, and a tutorial for doing the service worker, which is also not super hard, and some other stuff there. Okay? Cool stuff. Now, that's web apps. Let's talk about regular apps, the apps that you're used to, the apps that we actually call apps, the ones that come from the store. Now, I'm going to sneak preview and tell you that the oracle of everything app is sitting in the audience, and her name is Emily Grossman. She's right back there. She knows more than Google does about this stuff, and I'm just kind of being her voice right now. She is crazy well-versed on all of this stuff. I'm pretty good. She's the oracle. So she wants me to tell you that app indexing is all about giving apps entry points. Since they don't have URLs, you kind of have to overlay entry and exit points onto the app. Just like a JavaScript website, you have to give Google something to latch onto. And that's a URL. You put URLs on top of the existing apps, and they become indexable. So there are good reasons for having native apps and good reasons for having web apps. Web apps we just talked about, but they have their problems. Native apps solve a lot of those problems because they're not as slow. People really like engaging with them, and they have kind of the razzle-dazzle factor. The problem is they have minimal reach. As it turns out, the number of apps downloaded from the App Store per person last month, and for the previous, basically 2 years of months, average number of apps downloaded from the store, how many? 0 per person per month. People aren't looking for new apps. It's gone. No one cares because they have the apps they want already. So the reach of an app, even though you're throwing tens of thousands of dollars at it, the reach can be quite limited. And so that's expensive. That can create minimal or negative ROI on an app development project because people just aren't looking for your app for the most part. As it turns out, apps represent 86% of the time that people spend on their phone, and every app developer you ever meet will tell you this. They want you to believe it. The problem is that 86% is represented by the top 3 apps. It's Facebook, it's YouTube, and it's Facebook Messenger is 86% of the time that we're spending on our phones. The remaining 20 or so percent is fought out by a couple of apps, but remember, what we're tracking here is time spent in apps. So who wants to throw out apps that take a lot of time, like Netflix and Hulu and Google Maps and Gmail? Those guys are taking probably the rest of the time, leaving a very small portion available for you guys to fight out to get eyes and time in your app. Here's something else you probably didn't know. 66% of all digital purchases that happen on a mobile phone still happen on the web. So in terms of ROI in the app, your metrics are going to be so skewed, because even if you have an app, no one's finding it, no one's downloading it, and definitely no one's spending money there. People still spend money on the web because they don't have to download it. It's a much easier interaction. The money happens on the mobile web. Okay, so we solve this problem by making the apps more discoverable, by getting the apps themselves indexed, but also the content in the apps indexed. To do this, we have to create lists and mapping documents, and we have to host them on the web. So what you do is you update your app so that it follows HTTP or HTTPS app schemes. What that means is app developers kind of made up their own word for like URL. An app scheme is basically a URL for content in the app. And historically, app developers were off doing their own thing, and they had custom app schemes and this app scheme and that app scheme. But now we're saying, hold on, guys. Just do what we've already figured out. This works on the web. It'll work for you, too. So if you create HTTP and HTTPS app schemes that match perfectly what's happening on your website, then you create a union, or you can create a union, and a bunch of matching content where there's app version and web version, and Google can evaluate and rank it. Now, it's not enough to update the app. You have to put the mapping document on the website as well. In Apple, it's called an Apple App Site Association file. It's basically, if you look at it, it looks a lot like a robots text file. It says, this matches up with this, and it should or should not be indexed. Same thing exists on Android, but they call it something else, just to be cheeky. It's called an asset links file. The next thing you do, you host these files on your website. There are two places that Google looks for them. They look for them in the root directory, and they look for them in a .well-known directory. Who knows why? But that's where they're looking for it. So again, it's a lot like a robots text file or an XML sitemap, because Google is actively looking for these there. Now, once you get indexed, there are some benefits above and beyond ranking for app indexing. Once you're indexed, you can also auto-populate. So if people start to search Google for something that looks like they're searching for your app, Google will show it to them automatically, especially if you have it downloaded. That, again, helps solve the reach problem, right? People can now see your app, remember they've downloaded it, remember that it has the content that they're looking for. But here's the problem. The association in the mapping document has to be to the canonical on the web. If you do 301 redirects, you move a section of your site, but you forget to update your mapping documents for your app, you've broken all your deep links. This is the * problem we see. So this is what those link files look like, right? They really do have a lot of the same / kind of robots text rules. And they're not all that complicated. But remember, you always have to map to the canonical. You can't 301 content on your website and not deal with it in the app association files. Okay, so if it sounds pretty easy, why is everyone not doing it? It's not that hard. Here's the deal. The problem with the status quo is that it's a problem. It's expensive. It takes a lot of time to handle Android, Apple, and web, right? And sometimes you have 3 different teams working on it, and they're not talking to each other, so you're spending triple the time, triple the money, and triple the inconvenience of trying to get these teams that don't normally work together. That's really tough. And this is actually the biggest problem we solve. It's not like redirects and stuff like that. It is actually getting teams to communicate and introducing teams to each other. Because each of these teams tend to have their own group, and they don't necessarily talk. So the web team will make an update and forget that the app teams exist, or that they've mapped anything to anything else, and they break everything without even knowing. Here's the other thing. These teams all use different words to describe mostly the same thing. And so they're not communicating, and even when you set them together, they don't speak the same language. So you have to have translators and interpreters to explain, oh, well, in Android, this means that, and in iOS, this means that. The language, it's not a common language, so it can be very hard for them to communicate, and they give up. So you have to have someone ushering those conversations. So Google thinks they've solved this. And if you were watching Google I/O this year, you probably heard a lot about Firebase. Firebase is Google's new app platform, and it's pretty cool. The idea is Google thinks it's the answer. It thinks it's going to bring everyone together, make everyone able to communicate with each other, or make those communications irrelevant, right? Because it's going to do all the work for you. Sounds great. Problem is, most SEOs don't get it. Google hasn't done a good job of communicating about Firebase to the SEO community. But basically, it does the work of giving native apps and web apps indexing points, entry and exit points. And so it makes all of the crawling and indexing easier, especially when you realize that part of Firebase is this hosted solution where Google takes all of your app content and says, let us host it for you. And then they don't even necessarily so much have to crawl and index it because they've already got it. It's there. They get it. They can access it at their leisure because it's in their cloud. That's great for you because it makes everything that much faster on a Google cloud-hosted solution, and it means things happen uniformly across all of the platforms. So that's cool. Google has a vested interest in this because it makes their services faster because they don't have to do all the processing of a query as much when they host all of the content already. It also gives us the ability to have these things that Google calls dynamic links, where Google has all of your content in Firebase, and it says this screen in the iOS app equals this screen in the Android app equals this URL on the website. And they say, we don't want to index all that 3 times. Why don't you let us give you a short link that means those 3 things with just this one link? And so they index all of those things together on one link. That creates a lot of efficiency for them, but also a lot of efficiency for your users because your users can share things in an app to a friend on a different operating system and not worry that it won't work, but also not worry that the app's not installed because it'll default back to web if they don't have it. It's a really great solution. So here's the fun part of the talk. I'm going to tell you what I think this means for the future. I love this part because you can't really argue. I'm not telling you this is fact. This is just what I think is going to happen. So we know that Google likes to entice us with ranking boosts. They gave us one for HTTP or HTTPS for mobile friendly. They gave us one for setting our apps up for indexing in the first place. And then when they launched the app indexing API, they said, hey, we'll give you a boost for using the app indexing API. If you have universal links, then you can be in the app indexing API. That's a boost. And then I think Google soon enough is going to say you get a boost for Firebase integration because Firebase makes Google's job that much easier. It also makes it better for the users because if you think about a native app, it's got a limited reach, right? A native app for your iPhone only works on other iPhones. A native app for your Android phone only works on other Android phones. When they encourage you to say, hey, also you should make your web app a progressive web app, that one will work anywhere, regardless of the platform. And then if they say, hey, also, since you're already here, you've got all that stuff going, just drop it into Firebase, you'll get a rankings boost. Then they have a way of making sure everyone gets the best, fastest, coolest experience possible by giving you the rankings boost. Now, let's think about this with deep links in mind. In the upper right-hand corner of this slide is an example of a deep link. If you've been in SEO and been paying attention, it might look a little familiar because it's based on Google's old URL shortener, which, when they launched it, they talked about using it as a central place to disambiguate deep links, essentially to make it the one link for all of your related content. So you're hosted in Google's database. You have better app indexing for all of your apps, whether it's native or progressive. Enter Android Instant Apps. Who's heard about these? Google has started a beta where they're indexing screen previews of native apps, Android only right now, native apps that don't have corresponding web content. I think that they're using Firebase to do it, because Firebase gives them the deep links they need, but also the content they need. And then you can just create a shell and have an Android Instant app that works without a download in the cloud, right? That's cool. And it's in their best interest because it keeps the game on their turf. They know web, and they want things to happen on the web, and they don't want you to have to download things. So they want it all to happen in the web. So I think we're going to see iOS instant apps eventually when they figure it out. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's possible. What's interesting about that? No need for app stores. They can cut the app stores totally out of the equation. So that means right now we already know that app packs are ranking and you can download apps directly from a Google search result. I think the stat is 46% of apps are now downloaded from an app pack rather than going through the app store and starting there. This is a big, big deal. So let's think about it another way. Google encouraged HTTPS, and that's important. They gave a rankings boost. Google launched AMP with Google Web Services to do the caching, right? The Google hosting. AMP uses Google hosting. And now PWAs in Firebase also use that same Google hosting for Firebase. Next, if we talk about app indexing on dynamic links, that's going to enable cross-device behavior, not only between phones, but between other devices that are trying to use the content in apps, but struggling. So things like Android Auto can now interact with your, in this view, can now interact with your iPhone and your Android phone because it's all happening in the cloud on the internet, and it doesn't require your operating system to latch in. Beacons, Google Home, all of that stuff will be able to work with Android and iOS because it's all happening in the cloud. Then we get to the potential non-parity indexing, which we know is already happening for Android, but probably will happen for iOS as well. And with app packs, there's no need for the app stores anymore, but beyond that, it's much easier to monetize your apps and all of your content when it's in Firebase because you have the cross-device attribution and there's tracking in there. But beyond the tracking, there's actually the ability to export it all to Google BigQuery, which is their big data tool. So you can create really, really sophisticated marketing campaigns based on the data coming in an ongoing big data kind of way. And that's cool. And that means Google helps you monetize better, and that helps them monetize better. And they're really happy about that. That's my conspiracy theory. A little bit more on that, just to give you a heads up. It seems like the Webmaster team hasn't started communicating much about Firebase, but they do have a division of ground that's interesting right now. Gary seems to be talking about PWAs and web. Maria seems to be talking about native app indexing and instant apps, and then John is talking about AMP and HTTPS, but no one's talking about Firebase. And that creates a problem because Firebase is still really unknown to the marketers, and the marketers are going to be the ones who push it through. Whoops. So that's a problem. There are other problems, though. Firebase can be really scary, especially when you start reading the documentation, or when you think about the commitment that it takes. So this is a quote from a developer, and it says, Google's going to have some work ahead of it, convincing developers to depend even more on its technologies. In February, Facebook shut down its mobile backend service called Parse, leaving many developers scrambling. So developers are worried that if they do all this work to get into Firebase, that Google may eventually abandon it, and then they've wasted their time. And that's a risk, but I don't think it's a big risk, because Google's put a lot behind Firebase. But some people are also just worried about giving everything to Google. What if Google turns it against you? Also a valid concern. What I think is troubling is that for Firebase, and what a cool option it seems like it is, Google has a really unclear value proposition. They're not sure what they should be pushing. Some of them are pushing the cloud-hosted database, some of them are pushing messaging and ads, and some of them are pushing analytics, and they're not really pushing app indexing that hard as a value proposition. So you read the documentation, and it depends on who wrote it, what kind of a perspective you're going to get. It's a bit odd. But also, it's difficult to set up. Unless you have a team of developers for each platform, you're going to struggle, because one SEO really can't set it up, because you have to download the app development software for each of the apps, and you have to know the website, and you have to do all these massive downloads just to do 5 minutes worth of work, but you have to learn how to do that work in the platforms. It's not as simple as setting up Google Analytics or Webmaster Tools / Search Console. We've done it, so I know the pain. It's not fun, but it is possible. But the worst is the documentation. Google's documentation here is so myopic and horrible, so what was supposed to be like this unifying proposition to bring everyone together so that they say kumbaya is actually written by web developers for web developers, Android developers by Android developers, and iOS developers for iOS developers, and there aren't unifying documents that say, hey, this equals this in those two platforms and this on web, and here's the overall investment that you're going to need, and here are the pros and cons. That stuff doesn't exist. It's all developer documentation and then fluff. There's no in between that's like, here's what your C-levels need to know, or here's what your planning team needs to know. That stuff doesn't exist. So it's a risk. So should you use it? Maybe. What you have to, the key takeaway is that you should be watching it. You should be aware of app indexing, especially for progressive web apps, but also you should be working on native app indexing, because those things matter before you get into Firebase. Firebase will help get that stuff indexed, but it won't do all the work for you. But it does make all of that indexing more valuable, because it gives you this centralized utility to handle acquisition, engagement, and measurement. Everything that we're trying to do as marketers, it puts it under one place, and it means that you don't have to rely so heavily on developers to make changes, because you can make changes in Firebase without being a developer, and those go live in the cloud and then down to the apps immediately without you having to write the code. So once you're set up, the idea is it's much, much easier to handle. You also get the benefit of the cross-platform analytics, where you can say, oh, this page does way better in Android than iOS, or this page does way better on web than Android, and you can say, I wonder why. And you can make good decisions based on that. Right now, if you're trying to compare web traffic with app traffic, you can be lost, because it's all in different platforms, and you can't necessarily trust that those metrics really work well together, right? You hope that they do. But when it's all coming from the same platform, it does. It's helpful. It's useful. It's not just kind of disparate sets of data. This is how Google explains it. Again, I think Google does a horrible job of explaining Firebase, especially for SEOs. But they do have a lot of delightfully colorful graphics like that. I prefer this one. Fire gives us cooked meat, and it gives us the ability to do cool things. So if you think about Firebase and the cloud hosting, the main thing is it becomes your CRM, your CMS, and your CDN. If you don't know those words, don't worry about it. It becomes your cloud host, and it does all the hard work for you, and you have to pay fewer people and set up fewer things. That's good. The other thing is you get this cool thing called remote config, which is to say that since Firebase has all this data in its database about all of the different platforms and about specific users who are logged in using the app, they can actually send out different versions of the content to different users, kind of like a multivariate test, but in a very knowing and intelligent, planned way, so that you can basically have any number of versions of your app out there in the wild that are remotely configured based on one particular user's preferences, or one set of users' preferences, and they can coexist, and you don't have to submit them to the App Store. And you can get specific data on this version of the app that's been created for soccer moms, and that version that's been created for another group, and so on and so forth. And you can target and target and target, so you get very specific and having, at the same time, multiple versions of the app. You get the cross-device attribution, better ad management, push messaging that you can measure across all platforms, the real-time database, link sharing that's easy for your users, all this stuff. It's awesome. And on top of that, I think there will be some synthetic versions of data and things that you can do that are spun out after that, and that's great too. That's it.